If you could find your seats, we're going to start. Somebody told me that the key to a good conference was to get the best speakers you possibly can and get the hell out of their way. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Mike McNamee from Swansea University.
Thank you very much, Michael. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming in on a beautiful sunny afternoon that you don't often get in London at this time of year. So grateful that you're going to come down, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy a great session. The Future of Anti-Doping. It's an auspicious title, which I hope we in the panel will live up to. The structure of this session will be as follows. I've decided to dispense with a general statement from all speakers. I've given them the following task. You've got one sentence with not many clauses to say what you think the most pressing challenges and opportunities are for the future of anti-doping. And they're all going to give you a one-sentence answer. I hope it won't have 15 semicolons, right? Then we'll pick up on those issues in a fairly free-form way. I'm hoping that the panel will have a lot of interaction and maybe some fruitful friction as well. Then I'm going to open the floor to discussion for around 40 minutes. And I'm going to finish by asking the panelists the same question and to see how the session itself has modified or not the views that they hold. So if I may introduce the panel to you. First, we have Kara Goucher, who is a double Olympian, multiple medal-winning long-distance runner from the States. She's a committed proponent of clean sport and contributed recently to the BBC investigation in relation to the Oregon training group. And she wants me especially to say that she's a very proud mum to Colt. So welcome, Kara. Secondly, we have John Coyles, who's Vice President, Drug, Health and Safety Programs at Major League Baseball, where he oversees all aspects of Major League Baseball's drug prevention and treatment programs, including the management, medicine, and science programs. John also plays a key role in collective bargaining, which is also the idea of collective action is going to play its role, I think, in the second half of this panel. Thirdly, we have Sue Backhouse, who is Professor of Psychology and Behavioral Nutrition and Director of Research in the Carnegie School of Sport at Leeds Beckett University. And she's one of the world's leading psychologists working in the field of anti-doping research. Fourthly, we have Dr. Peter van Eenoo, I tried to get that right, who's full professor at the Ghent University, director of the Belgian WADA accredited laboratory, and has been involved in anti-doping research for human and equestrian sport for nearly a quarter of a century. And finally, then, we have Dr. Matthias Kamber, former head of Anti-Doping Switzerland and former winner of the Larry Bowers Award for excellence in anti-doping science, relevant to us, and a former member of the Swiss Ministry for Sport, among his other distinctions. So I hope that we're going to have a great session. I have asked Kara to both start and finish the proceedings, so she has the honor of kicking us off. What's the most pressing issue, challenge, opportunity for the future of anti-doping?
One sentence. From the athlete perspective, I think we want to see more targeted testing, which in the press lately has been called intelligence testing. And we also need more whistleblowers, people who are actually on the ground who see what's happening, and we need to make them feel comfortable that they can come forward. Right now, it's not a good place to come forward. It's a scary place to be. You're kind of ostracized. So we need to make it so that they're more welcome. They feel more welcome. They feel like they can trust people to talk.
So the future of anti-doping looks to whistleblowers.
A big part of it, from my perspective, yes.
One sentence. If Kara Goucher and Edwin Moses are not happy, we're not doing something right. So, semicolon, it's absolutely critical that we return our focus to clean sport and take rational, reasonable steps to regain athlete trust and promote integrity and fairness through changes to our anti-doping programs.
I'm going to stick with that narrative in that we really have to recognize just how complex a behavior doping in sport is. And we have to move away from an approach that is around individualizing the problem, particularly at the level of athletes, So where a lot of our programs are telling athletes what they should and shouldn't do and seeing that that is the source of the solution, it is multifaceted, it's complex, and it involves everyone in this room, and therefore solutions involve everyone in this room.
Clearly, at the moment, saying everything in a single sentence. That is my biggest challenge. So, forgive me if it's going to be two sentences.
No, on grounds of equality. Level playing field, you've got one question, one statement.
As coming from a laboratory, it is the lack of funding and the ever-expanding list of substances and methods we need to detect with that limited funding. And as an anti-doping involved person, I think our biggest challenge currently is that we need to stop the fighting between the stakeholders, because I fear that we're losing the athletes and we're losing the spectators and their involvement in anti-doping. And I think this is the worst thing that can happen to us. If we lose their support for this fight, the fight's over.
More effective cooperation among the stakeholders.
Yeah.
Okay, one sentence. We, 20 years anti-doping, WADA, 15 years code, we came a long way. We achieved a lot, but we over-regulated. Therefore, we have to step back a bit and look at the central task. Maybe we should assign several tasks to different organizations that WADA can focus again on the key task they should fulfill.
Okay, well, that's off the cuff. The first response is I'm going to go straight back to Matthias, right? So how are you going to then allocate who gets which of these key tasks for the future of anti-doping effectiveness?
So in my thinking, we have the too big to fail syndrome with WADA. So we dumped all the tasks to WADA. They can't do everything. So I think WADA should focus again on rule setting and then to have smart, creative solutions in the field to help athletes and ADOs. Maybe compliance should be given to professional companies, for instance, ISO companies who are used to do audits, who are used to look at fulfilling of tasks. Research should be given to PCC. They've proven to do the best here. Education, maybe here, international federations and IOC should step in again. They have the role models and looking at the athletes. They are willing to do this. And so WADA could really focus again on the key issues, on having smarter solution in the field.
Now, clearly, there's no one on the panel who directly represents WADA's interests. I'll declare my interest. I'm the ethics panel of WADA. I'm not here to defend or criticize it. But you've used a key word there, which is a really interesting one, compliance. Compliance is borrowed from the medical profession, right? The doctor says, here is the regimen, this is what you've got to comply with if you want to get well. And it's quite a hierarchical model. I'm not sure I see major league sports who've got collective bargaining having a compliance model. They've got to have a concordance model, right? They're working with their partners. So the language that we use here is going to be critical. Do you see yourself, John, in compliance mode with the players?
Absolutely, we're working hand in hand with this. If you look to the actual title of our anti-doping program, it's the Joint Drug Prevention and Treatment Program. That joint term refers to the league, MLB, and the players' union. And we're jointly working on this together to put together the strongest program we possibly can. I've been doing this for a while, and my experience with our players group, who are represented by their union representative here, is that they want a clean game. They want to put in procedures and policies that will support the clean athletes, deter potential use, but they also want to have their voice heard. We have heard from our players. We look at our program every single year. The frequency of our testing was recommended by the athletes themselves, but they also want rights like due process, confidentiality, important things like that. So we have to jointly administer our program with the union under U.S. federal law, and in my personal view, and I think my colleagues in the room agree, that the player participation has only added value and made our program stronger.
You actually negotiate around levels of testing?
Yeah, we have to. Any impact on the player's employment, including an anti-doping program that has a financial impact, potential disciplinary impact, we have to negotiate. So we cannot move forward with any change or improvement unless the players agree to it. But the great experience that we've had, particularly over the last 5 or 6 years, has been, I come to the table, my colleagues come to the table with ideas to improve our program, but we also hear from the players themselves. And they have become incredibly outspoken on social media and in public. But in the room, I mean, the athletes themselves are very sophisticated. We always want to hear from them. And if there's ever an improvement or an upgrade that's been recommended by the athletes themselves, as a league, we're in a really difficult spot to not agree to that because we both have the same focus, which is to promote a clean game, but we just want to make sure that we're considering the athlete perspective as well.
I'm going to invite Sue in as a professor of psychology about how that change in tone, rather than the top-down compliance model, how you think that would affect the future of anti-doping outside of the major leagues?
Fundamentally important. Our behaviour as a human being is very much determined by when we feel we've got some autonomy and some say in the decisions that we make. And when we perceive that all those decisions are being made for us, we're not going to fully engage in those decisions. We're not going to own them as if they are our own. And I think one of the biggest challenges we face, and I think we've heard over the last few days, is as a community, we need to engage and empower so that this isn't just something we have to comply with because we are being told we have to. This is what we want to do because we're part of the decision making and we're part of setting out the future of our sport.
Well, I'd like to push that over to Cara. There's a big push toward athlete rights, athlete representation, athlete voice, different terminologies to describe broadly the same thing. What didn't you have in your experience? And what would you want? And if I might follow up with the third part there, who would you want to do it on your behalf?
That's a tough question. I mean, from my personal experience coming from track and field, we have a small sliver of the pie. So it's very terrifying to raise your voice or to dissent or to say anything against what your governing body does because you only have this little slice, you don't want to lose it. There aren't a ton of opportunities. So I feel like now that I've gotten older, I don't care what people think as much anymore. But when I was younger, I would have been much more hesitant to speak out or to go to USADA or to speak to the BBC or do anything like that. So I feel like with the panel yesterday of the athletes, that was good to see. They're finding their voice, and the more people that speak, the less scary it is. And so who do we want to speak for us? We want to speak for ourselves.
Yeah, that's a given for me.
Right.
The question is, how do you decide, by what mechanisms do you choose, what criteria would you use, who would be best representatives for your voice?
Yeah, I mean, we've never really had that opportunity. So honestly, I feel like it would take athletes coming together and deciding that together. But that's never really been a proposal to us of you guys come together, you form your own group. I think we're starting to see some of that, as we saw yesterday, with other groups starting to form. It's hard because one of the things as an athlete is you're told to not be controversial. You have so many distractions, you're trying to eliminate distractions. So it is hard sometimes to get people involved as well because they don't want any more distractions in their life when they're trying to win an Olympic medal.
Mike, can I jump in there? I think point one in our world, the union representatives, while they have their own ideas and they're very sophisticated about anti-doping in their own right, they push forward. They provide a platform, kind of like the panel yesterday, for the baseball players to speak out. They're not going to make a proposal or agree to something unless the players or the athletes themselves are on board with that. But I'm viewing our panel today somewhat talking about challenges and future initiatives, but also as a little bit of a summary at the end of day 2 of this PCC conference. So I've been thinking a lot about the remarks today and what has already been said at this conference, and I think the first speaker really hit the nail on the head for something that folks like Kara would probably be on board with is, for an effective anti-doping program with integrity to be successful, you have to have good people. You have to have good leadership. And I think there was a potential good leader on the stage yesterday, but also for those, there's many potential leaders in this room, people that care about clean sport, that are good people, that are reliable, hardworking, vigilant, and just have a high level of ethics and integrity. And I think, it's not one specific person, but that is all the things that go into the goals that we all have. And those are the type of people that should be, whether it's the athlete voice, whether it's the, anti-doping authorities voice, those are the type of people we need in place.
It would be difficult for me, I'll come to Matthias, come to you now. It would be difficult for you to see what would the athlete role be in negotiating, for example, how the science was undertaken? I mean, where do you want to say are the limits and the utility or the usefulness of the athlete voice contribution? Peter, can you see any contribution to the laboratory work?
Well,
Or indeed think about the whole process from sample collection through to analysis.
Well, I would say don't underestimate some of the athletes neither. There are athletes who have academic degrees. There are athletes who are scientists. They can certainly assist. Whether or not they would be able to lead us, I don't think so, but still their voice can be heard where they think that we would need to most prominently put our research money to, where they see dangers for the future. But I know that there are several people in our labs who dedicate their daily life to it, to seeking out what is the next challenge for us and how are we going to tackle with that. And I don't think that many athletes do this, but there are definitely good scientists among athletes who can say, look, this is what we're looking at, and this is what you would need to focus on. We think that this is a prominent danger, and perhaps they can advise the PCC, for example, in perhaps you should allocate some funding to that with targets. Having said that, I also know that there are universities. Cologne, for example, is a sports university. So by definition, it is a university full of athletes. So they get feedback immediately. There are other people who work together with athletes among us, not to test them to see if they're clean, but just because they make master theses. We had one of my master thesis students about 5 years ago was an Olympic athlete. I didn't put her on anti-doping, I put her on nutritional supplements. You know, there needs to be some separation there, but we had direct impact from her thoughts in our lab, and I think there are many labs like this who work together with Olympic athletes or lower level athletes, but who work together with athletes, and it's important that we listen to them. Just like any other organization involved in anything with sports has to listen to the athletes, because finally they are the people for whom we are doing the testing.
Democratization, even in the science, okay.
I guess some years ago we had been smiling at the professional leagues anti-doping program saying, okay, that's not good enough. But you came a long way because you have the advantage, you included the stakeholders, and we did in some sense. So I can give you an example in Switzerland when we had this Tour de France scandal. We had a roundtable discussion also with athletes, and then they said, okay, your anti-doping program is not good enough. And then Switzerland was one of the first countries introducing professional DCOs. We introduced ISO accreditation for the whole process to prove that we are better, to have somebody outside testing us. Then we can say to athletes, we test you, but we are also tested by somebody else. And this improved the trust. So we did a lot of surveys with athletes, feedback, and we know exactly where our weaknesses are and where our strengths are. And so it's really important to include these stakeholders. And if we don't do it, then we will do some kind of fight against doping beside them. Then we will fail.
Even if we're going to have those stakeholders and give a proper role and recognition for them, what's going to be then interesting is how they organize themselves. Here you might have single sport, quasi-unionized movement, but then you've got pan-sport bodies. And, has anybody got any thought about the way they think this is going to move in the future in order to make anti-doping more effective? Does it have to be sport-by-sport basis?
Yeah, I won't comment on the athlete organization piece, but from a harmonization piece, I do think that goal may have had its day, and I'm a big proponent that individualized sports, different sports have an entirely different set of issues. You know, the challenges faced within baseball, given the grueling schedule, the salaries of the athletes, the locations that they participate in, their geographic regions that they go in the off season, whatever the case might be, it's quite a bit different than the challenges faced within the sport of weightlifting or some endurance sport like track and field. So if you're really looking to uphold the integrity of the game, you need to put in place policies and rules that are specific to the sport. While they may differ, as long as the overall overarching goal is to uphold the integrity of that sport, I think they're appropriate. I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all anymore. I think, given just the difficult challenges and the challenges that athletes face generally, given some of the unintentional exposure risks and things like that exist, out there through dietary supplements and other things. You really need to examine the issues, get views from all of the stakeholders involved, and agree to policies that will get us as close to the goals as we possibly can.
The sorts of experiments I get involved in are thought experiments, because I'm a philosopher. And there's no difficulty in seminars having deep discussions about alternative futures. And one of the ones that we've conducted would be to scrap the word harmonisation, because it's the wrong word in the first place. Right? So harmony is when several people sing differently in order to create a more complex unity. But that's not what we've got. We've got standardisation. So harmonisation, actually, if pursued, I think, in a conceptually coherent way, would mean differentiation, according to good principle, right? So one of the things we might test out is, we can't have an anti-doping policy for every sport, right? That would be insane. So how would you get relevantly similar sports groups together? Would you do it over endurance, power, multiple sprint? How would we harmonise different kinds of anti-doping approaches and maintain some coherence and consistency?
That's a really difficult question. So looking at what we have the situation today, for instance, the Swiss constitution has roughly 28,000 words, ruling everything. The code 2015 has about 35,000 words. So we are over-regulating, and when we're over-regulating, that's even more than standardization. I'm in favor to have standards, procedures, processes in place, but do not regulate everything. Leave some room for individual things. Every sport has some individual aspect. Every culture has an individual aspect, for instance, in education. So you can't have an international standard for education. It's not working. So we need to find the balance that is not drifting apart as we had before 20 years ago, but we need to go to step back again and have only principle standardized, only processes standardized. For instance, the doping control process, that's had to be standardized, but education maybe not. Or we forgot, with all these regulations, we forgot to make our homework. For instance, governance. As it was said today, this morning, by Michael Ask, that we are not good in governance. We regulate everything, but the governance of WADA is not good. So when you have one person sitting in different boards, IOC, WADA, ITA, then it's not a good governance. Then you lose the faith and the trust of athletes. So we first have to do our homework to have good governance in place and then try to regulate more.
I'll come back to that.
Versa.
I'll come back to that. Sorry if I've been speaking a bit quietly. Sue.
Yeah, no, I wanted to follow up on what the point was about trying to simplify and to go more around principles and processes, because actually, from the research that we've done with multiple stakeholders, one of the real big concerns, or not concerns, one of the things, the emotion that stands out most strongly is the fear of getting it wrong. So when we talk with coaches, they're scared of not fully understanding this really complex document and giving really bad advice to their athletes and players. So therefore, they would rather not be the person that knows about that. So we've lost one opportunity because they're fearful of a person who can be a preventer in our system. And the same applies to athletes. And even David Cowan said yesterday, he's even confused by the list and is a highly regarded expert in this field. So how can we expect very emergent athletes to understand, and their parents to understand, and their coaches, and the support network around them, who I would argue are one of the most important aspects to the future of clean sport, is that empowering network around. Because we talk to parents, and we say, do you understand about any of the risks of supplement use? And they haven't a clue. And actually, they are potentially the ones that will provide those supplements to their young athletes. Similarly, from a medication point of view, they will be the ones that open the medical cabinet and provide the substance. So I think the fear is stifling and is probably something in the future that we really need to break down.
But nobody's going to call for a return to the bad old days. where an athlete in one sport gets a slap on the wrist, an athlete in another sport gets a 3-year ban. Right? So there was a point to standardization and a good reason for it. It may be that its time is coming to an end, but I think we need some really clear alternatives, some concrete alternatives, if we're going to reconfigure that. Peter.
So in theory, I am all in favor of simplification and differentiation between different sports. The problem is that if you combine both, it's not going to be simplified. It's going to be much more difficult to have the complete overview. Perhaps per individual sport it will be more simple, but the complete overview will be much more complex. And think about an ADO, an ADO, who needs to go to different sports. How are they going to deal with it? Or are we going to have different rules in Switzerland than in Belgium, than in France? That's the situation we had before. On the other hand, I want to know, are there any lawyers in the room? Yeah, okay, I see some hands because I'm going to shoot. Now, part of the reason why the World Anti-Doping Code now has 35,000 words and no longer and not the 28,000 or whatever it was in the beginning is because the rules were fairly simple, and every normal person understood the rules. But then came the lawyers, who started to misinterpreting well-defined rules to plead their case. And so,
John, you're next.
To that simple rule, a footnote needed to be added. And then somebody found out that actually that footnote could be misinterpreted again. So there became a footnote to the footnote, to the footnote, to the footnote, to the footnote. And so, yes, simplification, yes. That is what we need. But what we need in general, and this is not an anti-doping problem, this is a society problem. We need people to stick to what is just, including lawyers. If somebody breaks the rules, he or she breaks the rules. Don't attempt anything you can just for the fun of trying to get that person off. And this is a society problem. It's not only anti-doping. And so it's a society problem as well that everything becomes more and more bureaucratic. It's not only anti-doping. I see it at my university. I see it in my country. It becomes more and more bureaucratic. Why? Because people are misusing the rules. And so simplification, all in favor. But I think we can simplify, and 10 years down the road, we're back to complexity.
Well, let's aim for more realistic goals, right? The future of anti-doping rather than the reform of the legal profession and all of society. John, in defense of lawyers.
As a fan of footnotes, I'll move on from that. But the main theme of Peter's comments is there's frustration out there. I've been sitting here in this room just like everyone else, and there's been some venting, there's been some complaining, and really, if you take a step back, we're all looking at this the same way. We all have the same goals. And as an optimist to a fault, and as someone who, not too many years ago, professional baseball was in a challenging spot on the anti-doping front, but through good relations with our athletes, through great leadership, through our 2 commissioners that have been in place during that time, through a significant amount of funding, but also a lot of hard work and vigilance on trying to land in the right place, we were able to pull out of that. And as of today, I mean, it's not about whose program is better than the others, but I'll put our program up against anyone. That being said, we all have a different job to do, even though we may all have the same goals. We are a collectively bargained professional sport in the U.S. We have a wonderful relationship with USADA. We have a great relationship with WADA. We can learn from each other. We've been through experiences. We've been through best practices. Honestly, if you're talking about the future of anti-doping, I think this is kind of the future of anti-doping. It's not about which set of rules are better. It's not about who can do a better job. If we're ultimately all in this together and trying to reach that lofty position of integrity of sport, I think we should learn from each other, work together to the extent that we can, and stop all of the infighting that is kind of taking place in the media over the last couple of months, but also to a certain extent at this conference.
Trying to tease out the complexities between structure and culture are going to be interesting. And you mentioned the word commissioner and the powers and role of it. I'm going to come back to Matthias on that for a minute. But I'd just like to ask the athlete perspective first. I mean, you've been in an Olympic team. Mm-hmm. Are you going to be totally comfortable with the fact that you're a long-distance runner forced to abide by certain anti-doping rules, whereas the cycling team are going to be up against a different set of rules potentially, or the sprinters another set of rules. Would that worry you?
I think so. I think it's difficult because every sport has its own challenges, and it has, I mean, baseball and marathon running are very, very different things. But I think the athletes would like to see somewhat of a standard that we're all held to.
Yeah, is that what was in your mind when you challenged harmonization, or Matthias, when you challenged it?
Yeah, you see, I'm not against standardization. So I say rules are rules. So if we have rules of play, 100 meters, 100 meters, so I do not have any problem with this. But I do have a problem as soon as something is coming up, then you have to have an international standard or a technical document, and then it's going. We should have, again, the courage to regulate principles and standards. And if you have this and something is coming up, then you always have the possibility to discuss what does it mean, and then you can go further. So if you look, for instance, some CAS decision, I'm not a lawyer, but sometimes I really enjoy reading it, because then you have all the arguments on this side, and then you bargain or something, like you said, and you make some kind of bargain, and then you say, this is what's happening now. And if you have a strict Article 2.5.6.7 footnote 2 and so then you can't. And this is what I think we should go back. I'm not against standardization, not against strict rules in the play or and so, but don't overdo it.
But if we're gonna drive, sorry, Peter, you come first.
Well, I have an opposite opinion about this. I've been in a few CAS cases, and actually the international standards, the technical documents, etc., they provide us confidence that if we go with our results, we did it according to the standards, there's no discussion. Because the scientific experts we're facing, they have the wackiest ideas on how an athlete became positive. Whether it's a chimeric twin, like in the Hamilton case, or whether, there's now a case where it is claimed that the steroid in the urine was because of the DCO might have used the steroid and exhaled into the urine. Because there is a scientific publication with the sense abuse, the inhaler we saw at the first day, you can do detection of steroids and other substances in breath. So the DCO breathed into the urine sample, and that's why the athlete is positive. And so it becomes very, very difficult. If we give them everything and they can start again, giving comments on every single analysis we do and every single element, it's over for us as a labs. The standards, they do give us a framework. If we do everything according to the standard, at least the lawyers, the judges, they don't care about that anymore. So standards are good. They really are good. It does become complex if you need to know all standards. And I think the essential is that there's lack of funding. If you would have sufficient staff, if you would have sufficient staff to take care of education, if you would have sufficient staff to take care of the sample collection, if you would have sufficient staff to take care of the TUEs, if you would have sufficient staff to deal with every single aspect, it would not be a problem. Problem is that all of our anti-doping organizations, they need to deal with all of these documents, and it comes down to a few persons. This is the problem, and that's why it's complex.
So I want to tease this out a bit. So everybody's going to say there's not enough resources, and that's about priority setting. Typically, it's whether you want something to happen or not, and that's going to depend on both governance and leadership, and I want to come back to you, Matthias, on that. But John, you raised the issue of a commissioner, and my guess is, within a sport whose governance includes someone with the wide-ranging power as a commissioner, if they're committed, they can drive change through that organization probably quite quickly and effectively. But that's not going to be a model for an IF, is it? Could that be a model for other kinds of sport organizations and their own governance structures?
Well, whether it's a singular individual in the form of a leader of the organization, or if it's a committee or whatever the case might be, if they make this a priority, it certainly can be. We were fortunate enough where our commissioners in place during the time that we were trying to make significant improvements gave us the funding necessary to do what we needed to do. We surrounded ourselves with the world experts. Our major league testing is done at the WADA accredited laboratory in Montreal. All of our testing is overseen by Christian Ayot, who's one of the best in the world, if not the best scientist in the world when it comes to anti-doping. We have other advisors that are the best at what they do, and that does require resources, but certainly we've had that luxury since the beginning. But it's also something, making it a priority from a league perspective is something that has really driven change.
Well, it's going to be really interesting to hear if there's iNARDO people in the room, if there are NARDO heads from small organizations, whether they think that model's for them. Challenging resources, lack of personnel, need for political support. I guess in a way you're in a privileged world there to drive change.
Absolutely, I'll be the first one to admit that, but I also think that we are all forced to operate under the budgets that we currently have in place, and I do think there's an opportunity through the research done by the PCC on alternative matrices, which could be potentially more cost-effective than some of the sampling that we're currently doing, and given some of our experiences that we've had over the last 12 to 24 months, I think looking at all aspects of the anti-doping program, from the collection equipment that we're using, all the way through the analysis that's taking place at the laboratory and the actual reporting that's taking place. If there are more budget-friendly, cost-effective ways to do things, we should seriously consider them, because to Peter's point, if the equipment being used for the sample collection process or the actual samples being collected don't require as many resources, that's that many more resources that can be applied for other areas. And living in a world that does have significant resources but also has a real need to meet the testing requirements that our players are asking for, but also conducting significant education, having one of the world's best, if not the world's best investigations team, that requires a significant amount of people, requires a significant amount of time, and those people need to be paid for their time. So that's something that we are certainly fortunate to have that in place. But I also think that regardless of what your budget is, taking a look at the goals and how to best meet those goals through cost-effective ways is something we should all take a look at.
Matthias, you want to add to that?
We could really try. I think we should be open for different models.
One of the problems be, once you've been a leader of an anti-doping program, perhaps a NARDO, where do you go after that for your career? I've always thought about this, it's an interesting question. Most of us think about a trajectory of a career, and then once you've done anti-doping, let's say you're head of an anti-doping program or a national anti-doping organization, where do you go to after that? Because it's not the kind of job I suspect you can do for 20 years, right? You're going to get face burnout. It's an intense job with highly political and economic pressures. Where do you go after that? So, and that leads me to ask, where do you want people to come from to be the best leaders of anti-doping? What kind of backgrounds do they require? Political, economic, legal, medical, scientific? Is there any kind of protocol here? Sue and then Matthias.
I think the biggest characteristic that we need to have in our leaders in the future is they need to have a high degree of humility. Fundamentally, they need to be really empathic as leaders, because what leaders, when we're talking about complex social problems like doping in sport, with multifaceted factors, we've got loads of different disciplines within the room, loads of different perspectives in the room. A really top-class leader of the future has to have a systems lens. They have to be able to see across every single aspect of that anti-doping landscape and be able to interrelate all of those aspects together. Where we've got specific subject experts, they tend to look at it through one lens. And then oftentimes resources then get channeled into the lens through which they are probably, through a legacy perspective, they are educated through. So it's very difficult to switch that lens. So I do think you need to have leaders who can see a whole system, who can act on a whole system, who can have generative conversations, who are comfortable with disagreement, and that are not defensive at an opportunity for improvement, that when a suggestion comes through, it's not, oh, we don't do that. No, we don't do that. We do it this way. That say, I'm really thankful for you to bring that information to me. I'm going to reflect on that. I'm going to consider it, and I'm going to... The way that our tone and our messaging as leaders comes through signals whether we want to hear, whether we're willing to hear, and whether we'll act. And I think also part of that is a leader needs to have a vision. Leaders, David Hammond talked about yesterday, we're only leaders if we have followers. Otherwise, we're going on a walk. The leader of the future has to be able to lead with inspiration and with empowerment and with engagement. And they're multiple qualities of leadership that not everyone can achieve straight away, but that doesn't mean that's not what we should be looking for.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better because I happened to be a chemist. So it doesn't need to be a chemist. Some are a lawyer, some are... But I had been working 30 years in anti-doping, and I was always had the vision, be attentive. You have to look around, you have to see the developments. And as soon as you have it, you have to be creative. You have to do something with this information to help solve a problem. And when you are ready then, and then it's happening, then you can make the change. And I went through different changes in Switzerland, and I was always, I can say I was always a bit ahead because I had this vision, and I always spoke to the people. So you never, sometimes you're alone, sure, if you're on top, but you're never alone. You have the team, you have the athletes, you have to communicate. And as she said, if you can't do it, then you can't be a leader. So it doesn't really matter what you learned in university.
We're going to move toward an open discussion in just a few minutes. Peter, you want to come in, but I do want to ask something of the panel about education and how that gets reformed in the future of anti-doping. But first you, Peter.
I think the basic requirement to become a leader in anti-doping is the same basic requirement you would have for any other job. Passion for the cause. And if you've got passion for the cause, you will become a leader and people will follow. The problem is that I've seen that some people at some positions, they didn't care for the job. They didn't have passion. They could have just been ahead of something else, at something completely different. They wouldn't care any less. You know, and this is, I'm happy to say that at least within our laboratory network, I know none of my colleagues who doesn't have a passion for his or her job. Mm-hmm. And I mean, really, I'm not going to speak for the other parts because I don't know the people so well, but for the laboratory side, I can really say that every director, deputy director I know really likes and is dedicated to the anti-doping job.
I'm not sure what the test would look for that on the interview. And nobody would disagree with you, but I don't know how you determine it objectively.
Yeah, just to follow up, I mean, I couldn't agree more. But also one other trait that I think is very important given the landscape of the anti-doping world now is just a rational, level-headed approach. And I'm fortunate to be able to work with and for some very rational, intelligent human beings who, before moving too quickly, we do run a strict liability policy, for example, where our players are responsible for the substances that are detected in their body. But given some of the challenges that we've already heard about at this conference, measuring things in single-digit picograms, for example, combined with the potential sources where that could go on, maybe we just want to take a step back and think about what is the actual goal here? What are we trying to accomplish by following up on an adverse analytical finding that it looks like that? If you have a whole collective of important athletes out there in the media speaking out about a decision, maybe you take a step back and think about whether you made the right decision or not. So I think that rational, level-headed approach is something that's very important for leaders as well.
Okay, I do want to ask this last question, and Kara, you're going to catch it, I'm afraid. You've been on the receiving end of education. I don't know if you've been on the giving end of it, but how would you foresee the development of educational programs in order to make anti-doping's future brighter?
In terms of with athletes? Yeah, so I mean, for years I would get, through the USADA program, we would get like our yearly education, have to answer a test, like basically watch this thing and then answer a test. And so I think you have to make the athletes do stuff like that because it's easy to skim over that and to not pay attention to certain things, and it's a good yearly reminder. Nobody likes to do stuff like that. You're like, oh man, I have to watch this video and answer this test. But I do think things like that are really important. I think it would be important too to get even younger though, start talking to athletes even younger, just informing them on choices and having them see athletes that have made proper choices and where it's taken them so that they're motivated at a young age to make the right choices throughout their career.
But there's lots of talk about athletes' rights, among other things, and good talk it is too. But in philosophy, there's no such thing of talks of rights without talks of duties. What do you think the obligations are on athletes then to be involved in education?
I do feel like you need to give back. I feel like you need to, if you're an athlete, if there aren't fans and people following you, then you actually don't really have a job, right? Everybody needs everybody. And part of that is when you're an athlete, you do have to really focus on yourself and train, but you also have to give back because otherwise the next generation isn't going to be there. I feel like that's a part of the responsibility of making as an athlete.
I'm absolutely certain that if you and I gave the same words in an education program, people are going to listen more to you than me.
Well, I don't know about that, but I'll
I'm
try.
pretty convinced of all that. And so I think while we talk about empowerment of athletes, I think athletes themselves as a community have to recognize that will come with its own obligations to us. And it would be good to see a balanced discussion of that. Right, we've had a great discussion for the first half of the program with our expert panelists. Let's open the floor to those who want to join the conversation. This gentleman in the middle at the back. Please just raise your hand. I won't know who you are, but if you can give me a wave or something, I'll try and add you to the queue.
Say it loudly right now. We'll get you a mic.
Try to shout out.
Yes, please.
At the beginning, a lot of you guys talked about how the system's a little bit overcomplicated. Peter, you mentioned the ever-expanding list with not enough resources. Matthias, you talked about how things are overregulated, and Sue spoke about just the overcomplication of the system. I think that one of the things that contributes to the overcomplication is the inclusion of illicit drugs like cocaine and cannabis on the list. That means that we have to have in-competition versus out-of-competition different categorizations of different substances. It also means that we have to put in those provisions to reduce sanctions. And I just wonder, Cara, as an athlete, would you have felt like, I mean, WADA serves athletes. The purpose of WADA and anti-doping as a whole is to protect the right of athletes to have clean sport. And I wonder, would you have felt like your right to have clean sport was inhibited if those drugs were removed from the list? Because it seems to me that government is blocking that removal. But why doesn't serve government? It may be funded partially by government, but it serves athletes. And I wonder, do athletes feel like those substances could now be removed? And to the rest of the panel as well, do you feel like we could remove those substances? Are those outside of the scope of WADA's real remit?
Cara, can I go to you for an athlete voice, and then can I go over to you, Peter, for a medical, scientific point of view?
I mean, I believe that they probably should still be banned, just for the health perspective, I would say. And I'm not going to pretend to be a scientist and know what could help different levels or different sports, but I just feel like if you start allowing certain things, then I don't know. My personal belief is that stay banned.
That's another example of the value to collective bargaining. We prohibit those substances, we test for those substances, but we treat them as in a clinical treatment setting, where if an athlete has a positive test or has an issue with, say, cocaine, we have 2 addiction psychiatrists on staff, we intervene, we put them on a clinical treatment program for purposes of getting him help. Ultimately, it can become a disciplinary situation if he refuses or fails to comply with that treatment program, but that is consistent with my personal view, but that's also one having a strong group of representatives for our athletes from the beginning of time, since the beginning that our drug testing programs were in place. We do look for those because we are at its kind of, as initial stages, we're a traditional employer-employee drug testing program. And there's certainly a health and safety component. If you're throwing a hard baseball 100 miles an hour, it's probably good to have the guy on the receiving end not be high on marijuana. But it is one where we just take a completely different approach, and in no way do we view it as a performance enhancing supplement.
Can you explain, because I don't understand, can you explain to the audience then, what's the process from which you go from a positive sample in this regard to counselling? What's the journey that the athlete goes on?
So the issue, there's a variety of ways that the issue can enter our world. If it's through evidence or some form of reporting, either through my counterpart at the Players Union or myself. We have a joint, again, MLB-MLBPA treatment board, where anytime we learn of a potential issue with a recreational drug, we convene. Majority of time, we'll conduct an immediate reasonable cause drug test, and we get the player in front of 1 or more clinicians as soon as possible. We rely on our doctors for a lot of reasons. We rely on our scientists for a lot of reasons as well. But we put that program together, and we inform the player that he is going to be subject to, regular frequent testing. We've had athletes tested multiple times a week sometimes, depending on their level of issue. But if he remains compliant with that and tries to get his addiction or whatever the case might be in check, he will not be facing discipline. If he fails or refuses to comply with that program that we collectively agree to, he could ultimately be disciplined in the future. But it's a very collaborative process. It certainly puts the health and safety and the well-being of the player first and foremost. But it's one where, again, been doing this for many, many years, and there's not a lot of disagreements when you're looking out for the best interest of somebody else.
Peter and then Sue.
Okay, so it's a very difficult question to answer. First of all, scientifically, the two compounds you named are extremely diverse. True, cannabis, if detected, is mostly because of social or asocial reasons. It's not for performance enhancing. Cocaine could be performance enhancing, that's clear. So there's a clear differentiation there. Secondly, you need to think that even cannabis, although not performance enhancing, I do believe that in some cases we really need to test, and I think everybody in the audience will agree that we would not like to have a stoned Formula 1 driver. So it's about protection of the health, not only of the individual athlete, but perhaps of his or her competitors and even the audience, the spectators in some cases. So it's quite complex in this regard. The other thing is that it's very dependent also on which public you're asking. And so I'm looking around the audience, and I have to say that most of us are people from Western society. And in most Western countries, and even depending on the part of the country you sometimes come from, there's quite an acceptance of the use of cannabis these days. This is not globally the same thing. And it can change pretty quickly. I remember 3 years ago, there was a Belgian cyclist winning a cycling event. And take into account, athletes are role models. After the cycling event, he has won, there's the interview. He does the interview live on television with the newspaper journalists there with a pint of beer. For the next 3 days, the newspapers were full of articles on, this is unbelievable, an athlete drinking beer. So in a very permissive society, because Belgium is quite permissive, that was not accepted for an athlete after a sporting event. So I think this is part why cannabis is still on the list, because athletes are role models, and many people also in a modern society would not accept that an athlete is using drugs. Whether or not they're performance enhancing, that's something else. It's just a role model, and I do tend to agree. I would not like to have even an athlete on television with a cigarette. And I have nothing against people using nicotine. That's their individual choice. As long as they don't force me to be present in the room while they're smoking, it's okay with me.
Okay, but what's, I think, important in the answer to the question is to get to the rationale. So in the first case, in John's case, an addictive issue is the harm to the self. So you might say the league has a duty of care toward that athlete, and this is the way it commissions its duty of care. In the Formula 1 case, think tramadol with cyclists.
Mm-hmm.
Harm to others, yeah, you could easily cause a crash. So harm to others is the justification. We don't want that to happen. The spirit of sport argument, the role model argument is a third argument again. So in a way, we just have to be clear, what arguments are we using when? Here's 3 possible arguments according to your underlying rationale. Sue, you wanted to jump in.
I wanted to jump in on one of the things that I think possibly we've been missing to some extent from the conversation over the last few days and in general is where do we sit around prevention overall? So some use of substance can come about because we haven't got the right coping mechanisms or the psychological capability to meet some of the demands of the sport that we're in. Where are we setting within those programs and processes adequate support for athletes to navigate the demands of sport? At the same time, where are we looking at the demands of sport and saying, actually, are they fair and just for an athlete to manage and navigate with the current resources they've got in place? So I'd like to also see the conversation look at, well, what does a preventive landscape of the system look like so that actually it's not a coping mechanism response, because there is so much support within the system to respond to some of the challenges that athletes are facing, that there isn't the need then for self-medication.
Okay, Matthias, the last answer, and then we're back to the floor.
I'm a little bit in a different position. I'm clearly of the view we should have doping should be regulated only with the hard doping substances. All the rest should be maybe regulated in code of conduct. So using cannabis, a code of conduct of a sport, for instance, news as well. So I can give you an example. I had once a case with a cannabis, and then a form we had to publish it, and then this guy was a sports student. They had been kicked out of the sports school, and then I met his mother in a discussion. She said, "Okay, you had been nearly responsible for the suicide of my son," and because then it was published in the newspaper, he was doping, but it's not doping in my thing, and so we should not mix. Doping should be really the performance-enhancing drugs we can go for 2 years, 4 years, 8 years, and the rest we should maybe regulate in code of conducts according to the sport.
I know, Matthias, and my immediate response to this is, it's already very hard to prove from a substance that it is performance enhancing. So calling it hard doping and soft doping will even be more difficult.
We have to try.
Yeah, but how will you differentiate between those substances? This is hard doping. Will we have a very hard doping, a moderate doping, a soft doping, perhaps doping?
The list. You already have the list committee.
We have the list, but even for the substances on the list, only for very few, it actually has been proven that they are performance enhancing. While athletes declare that if they're using it, they feel the effect. And that, as a scientist, I need to take part of the blame here. I'm not the scientist in investigating this, but science has limitations. And one of the limitations is that we probably cannot accurately measure the marginal gain athletes have from some substances. But they do have it. You know, if you're running the marathon, 1/10 of a second is enough to win. On a 2 hours and 6 minute run, our science currently, and although time is some of the best things we measure, is simply not good enough to measure a marginal gain of that 0.1 second. But that's enough. So I'm really
for this question anyway.
Okay, back to the floor.
Hi, great panel. 2 questions here. One is, we've obviously had a lot of discussion about the WADA decision about the Russia case, and 2 questions. One to the panel is, would we be having the same discussion about WADA if they hadn't made this decision? Did that cover up other issues that have been raised? And the other one to the lab directors, currently WADA requires that every lab do every test. Could you see a time where you could have centers of excellence? So one lab would be an EPO center, one would be a growth hormone center, one would be an IRMS center. Would that be a way to allow harmony and yet reduce the costs?
Peter, that's on you, I think.
Okay, so actually that has been a philosophy change within WADA, and that actually to a very limited amount is currently taking place. Not every lab needs to have the biomarker test for growth hormone. Not every lab needs to have a screening and a confirmation method for chorionic gonadotrophin. Not every lab needs to have an IRMS method for nandrolone, for boldenone. So if I put it economically, where the market is small, where there are not enough samples, WADA has now agreed that labs can have this technology or not have this technology. However, and I do believe that this is the way forward for specific technologies. But as soon as it becomes a standard test, I think all labs should be able to do it. Because we had this discussion a couple of years ago among the labs when there was this working group on lab accreditation from WADA. And one of the pathways that was put forward is that there would be an A, a B, and a C kind of lab. And so I had one of the lab directors, he was here earlier today, I don't see him here, Francesco Botre, who is always very good in saying things, and and he was said, our ADOs, our IFs will then look at the A labs as the acceptable ones. The B labs will be the bad ones, and the C labs will be the catastrophic labs. And so that's really something we don't want. But certainly for very specific technology, which does not have a lot of samples, which is hugely complicated at the same time, I think that is what we need. That we say, okay, this is an IRMS sample for a substance which only appears 2 or 3 times per year. Not all 32 labs need to have it, for several reasons. First of all, money goes down the drain for 31 out of 32 labs because they're not going to perform the test. Secondly, if you don't do a test often, you do not have expertise at that test. So also, scientifically, the athlete, the community is not best served by every lab having this. So WADA has taken this on board, and let's see how this evolves. But basically, I think if it's a standard test, it should be in every lab.
Talking of standardization, I'd like to ask this question. I mean, I'm a philosopher, I'm not a scientist, but to the labs, are the labs engaged in a market? How do they communicate with those providers who wish to give them tests? Are there standardized prices? Are there quicker returns of the results? Is there a market in laboratory testing?
There is a market in laboratory testing. There's just is no profit. So there is a market.
What would be the incentive of the labs to continue then?
It's a necessary component of the process.
I'm sorry, I'm talking half of the room. If I went to my vice-chancellor or rector of the university and said, we're passionate about anti-doping, can you, from the university's resources, please fund my lab for $1 million next year? I think I'd be shut the door quite quickly.
That is exactly what he does with me. I mean, our income from sample analysis, we spend on paying the salaries, on paying the instruments, on doing part of the research. That's what we do. There are a few labs who do get funded by their country. In Belgium, I get 0 funding, 0.
So that's got to be part of the discussion of the future of anti-doping then, right? It can't run on benevolence.
Right. But it's a collective effort, and if you had more volume, you would be able to charge more to your clients, or however you want to describe them. So it also falls on the anti-doping organizations to actually collect the samples and send them into the laboratory. It's a balance. You know, there may be too many laboratories currently if some of them have low volume, but if we reach that sweet spot of the appropriate number of laboratories and the appropriate number of samples being sent to them, it should be a self-functioning thing.
Sorry.
Yeah, I will add to this discussion as well, because I am in favor of having bigger labs, more centralized labs, multinational labs. So we will bring, we do not have the pressure of a nation on a lab to do some fraud, as we have seen in different countries. So if we were to have multinational labs, multinational staff, then we would have more samples coming in, we could perform all the tests, but this model never had been explored.
And I'd also like to say that model for education programs would be brilliant as well, where you've got multi-collaborating centres helping to develop education programs with athlete support personnel, all coming together and agreeing a common methodology would be equally as important. So if we move a bit more upstream, we might not need as many labs in the future anyway, because we're preventing it before it happens.
Chance to be a fine thing. We're over to the floor.
Well, congratulations for the panel, very, very nice. I'm very motivated to share something very personal with the panel. Why continue to do that? Don't ask that twice. I am the director of the Brazilian Doping Control Laboratory. I'm a professor in the university in Brazil. My salary to be the director is 0. My institution pay me to do research and to teach. I have no salary. So it's passion. I have to agree 110% with Peter. And I'm sure that maybe I'm not only in the team in that situation. That's passion, and that's it.
Wow, thank you for sharing. Back to the floor. Right at the back, please.
That's right. I've got quite a long way. I'd just like to ask John Coyles if he could speak a little bit about the challenge of setting up anti-doping in a country which has 50 state laws and within federal law, and also a sport which covers 2 countries.
Sure. we have to be respectful of them, but overriding that is the collective bargaining agreement that we have that's established under U.S. federal law. So while the change in state laws that are going on in Canada and also in our 50 states has presented some interesting topics for debate and discussion, as of now, we are, reliant upon the consistent set of rules that applies to all of our athletes, not just at the major league level, which includes 30 clubs, but we also have a significant minor league system that has, 200 or so different teams that are spread out throughout those two countries as well. So it's one where we are cognizant of the changes in state laws and where they're headed, but it's one where I think when you're talking about clarity of message, you don't want to have 50 different set of rules depending on where a game is played. So we want to have a clear, simple, consistent set of policies that all players can understand and attempt to abide by.
To the back on the left.
Can you hear me now? Great. This is a question to John and maybe Susan as well. Have you, because when I think about the psychology of doping, it's, as you know, it's quite complex. And I think there's, in the past, a lot of people who would not be inclined to do this. They look around, they see everybody who's getting ahead is doing it, and well, why not? And obviously that's part of anti-doping. But John, have you noticed in Major League Baseball's when you're testing the prospects, as your program's gotten better and better and more sophisticated, have you found that you're getting less positives when you test the prospects? Sort of that. Because, to some degree, we worry about the danger, not only the athletes, but, the Hooten Foundation. There's a huge issue with young people, amateur athletes. Well, all those guys are doing it. I can do it too. But have you noticed that things have gotten better at the lower level?
Yeah, I would like to think that I have. And what John is referring to is, in addition to our policies, drug testing programs that we have for our athletes under contract, we also have been, for about a decade, been engaging in pre-employment testing of the top prospects coming up through the U.S. system, which would be high school and college. But we also have a program, pretty significant one, of prospects in Latin America and other places where our athletes come from. I really think that hits on Kara's suggestion, where while testing is one component, we also educate them and try to raise awareness, and we bring forth kind of ethical considerations of playing the game the right way, being successful, not by cutting corners and not cheating. And while that's very difficult to measure, I like to think that given all of our efforts and our attempts to try to promote a clean game to the extent possible, that has been successful. But one measure, which is difficult to track, but given the kind of the perspective of our players, given the outspoken nature of their comments, and the fact that it's pretty consistent in them wanting to have a clean game and really trying to making sure that our union and the league are working together to put in place everything that could potentially head in that direction, I would like to think that it has had a positive impact.
I think just to follow up, we've done some research with high school sports people, and one of the things that really struck me was the perception of elite sport people is on average around 20 to 25% they perceive a doping. So that's young people between 16 and 19 that we surveyed. That was on average, and that's consistent across a number of the published studies that are available at the moment. The other thing that struck me when we talked to young people was that perception of use as well is not one of just enhancing performance. For some sports, it's actually about protecting health and well-being. Some of the contact sports in particular, the perception that they need to get bigger through the use of prohibited substances in order to avoid any injuries, particularly around neck injuries in certain contact sports. Sat within that, and I'm a very strong proponent around complexity, I'm a very strong proponent around looking at the environment and the system around athletes. What also struck me was a lack of awareness for teachers and coaches within that setting around some of the risks of their own behaviour and some of the language that they're using and some of the goals that they're setting, which are actually not realistic. They're not achievable in the time period that they're asking these young people to achieve them in, and therefore shortcuts are then part of a system that is asking for shortcuts. So that comes down to, again, that collective effort of thinking about what we're asking young people to do. And we have had young people say to us, I'm going to dope until I get to that next level, and then I'm going to stop because that's when I'm going to get tested. So again, the emphasis to me around prevention, because if a threat of detection is not there, we need other mechanisms and methods to prevent that from happening. So absolutely, I think there are obviously some good education programs that you're talking around there, which is getting to that level. How do we then increase the reach of those so that there is an equity of education globally and not just where necessarily resources at the moment? I think that for us as a system is how do we equalize opportunity for education in particular, because at the moment it probably goes to where resources is focused.
And I think back to just that one point, we are fortunate enough to have a significant amount of resources, but with that comes added responsibility. And I'm not really speaking out of turn because our others from our office have said this publicly in the past, but we take the position that Major League Baseball has a social responsibility to raise awareness on this issue, and whether it's working through with the Houghton Foundation, which we've done for over a decade, but just the overall trying to, we're working with Sue's group in Latin America, trying to educate the young kids, and hopefully that reaps benefits to deterrence, but also educating them on the risks to their health and the risks to the ethics of our game. And that's a very important issue to all of us that work in this space.
We've got about 15 minutes left. I'm a little surprised nobody raised criminalization. Nobody raised the scope of doping controls and whether recreational doping is something that should consider us in the future of anti-doping. And nobody yet has connected us to other forms of threats to the integrity of sport. And I'm mindful in education, there's lots of stuff on racism, anti-racism, homophobia, and other forms of discrimination, where anti-doping education might look for synergies, especially at younger level athletes, where you don't really want single item educational processes, but much more collective values-based education. No one's raised any of those yet, but I'll leave it to the floor if they want to pick them up. Next question, please.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. And I'm the chairman of the Education Committee for WADA, and we've distributed a lot of money and done a lot of research. As Professor Backhouse knows, she was at China and gave a very, very interesting synopsis of WISE, what's in WISE. And you mentioned the criminal model. We had a science symposium at USADA must have been 2 years ago, and we had a very interesting criminal law professor who came in and did a breakdown of what the risk and the rewards were for the athlete and the people around them. And he dealt with the theory that in the athlete's mind there were misdemeanors, there were felonies, and then there was a death penalty, which means banned for life. And he went through the whole analysis of how the athletes process it with people who are in their sphere of influence, whether it's a doctor, a coach, the parents, and it was very interesting. So that's one of the analysis of the criminality of the sport that comes from the athlete's point of view. And then, of course, we're dealing with the external criminality, outright penalties for doping violations, which there seems to be a little bit of movement on now. But I think Professor Backhouse knows that at WADA, what we're trying to do is really accomplish and do research all over the world, per language, per age group, language, regional, to really try to find ways to educate even kids that are like 3, 4, 5 years old that are learning to play rugby or learning to play cricket or learning to run track and field. When they are learning about the rules of the game, then there is a component that's age appropriate in which they will learn that there are certain things that are not tolerated in the sport, that there are certain behaviors, including age appropriate information on anti-doping, so forth. So we're trying everything that we can and have a lot of research out there that's going to be coming back to really kind of solidify and quantify exactly the pressures that an athlete may be under, whether you're world class or master's level or 5 years old playing Sunday soccer with the parents out there, or intermediate in between.
Thanks. Going back, and Sue.
Yeah, I think it's very important what you're saying. We did some research on public perception on doping and the sport itself, and then one of the recent surveys with the public was, does sport plays a very high or a rather high role in developing positive values for young kids. 99% said very high or high. So sport has a very high acceptance in Switzerland. And then we asked, have sports people, are they role models? And then 70% said yes for young kids. Then we asked, okay, what's the main problem in sports? And then doping was first, before corruption and everything. And then the next question was, so who should be more responsible to fight doping? And then the first place was the athlete. So we are here in a situation that athletes can do a lot when they are role models. So they cannot do a lot in education, anti-doping, but in the behavior of positive values. And so you do not have to have special education for corruption or racism. And so you have to have more role models. And then I remember once in the States when they had these basketball players involved in crime and so, and then Nike made an advertisement, we need more role models. And I think it's it. And here, international federations or the Olympic Committee could tap into the resource they have. They have the role models, and the young kids will listen.
Well, what that reminds me of, and my American friends will correct me here, but wasn't it Charles Barkley did an advert for Nike where he's bouncing the ball, and the narrative is, I'm not a role model. I'm not a role model. If you want a role model, find your mother, you know, look at the local doctor and so forth. Do athletes buy into that narrative? I mean, we might like to think they are and ought to be role models, and I do happen to believe that, but do athletes believe that?
I mean, I remember that campaign. That was like Nike's brilliant marketing campaign. We're still talking about it, but that doesn't mean it was correct, right? I feel like if you're an athlete, there is some responsibility there to be a role model for the next generation and to do things the right way and to inspire the next generation to do your sport and to keep it clean and follow the rules. You need to be an example. Your sport's going to die later on.
So what way do you see athletes collectively organizing themselves into this critical function then? I mean, I could see how it's in athletes' interests to mobilize themselves on contractual arrangements, on marketing rights and so forth. How are they going to mobilize themselves to become more role models? This is a challenge because these are people who have dedicated their entire lives, just like you did, to performance. Why would they want to accept this additional role?
Because we just do. I think we all have responsibility. Everybody on this panel has a responsibility towards clean sport, right? And part of the athlete responsibility is to abide by the rules and to give back and to do the right thing. It's important. It's really simple, honestly.
Okay. We have one right at the back. Thank you.
Okay, it kind of builds on what was just spoken about, but one of the things that I'm hearing from the panel is how it's really important that those of us in positions of power or influence are the right people and good people with integrity and strong morals and convictions, and we're talking here about leaders and kind of what we want from leaders and saying that athletes should be role models. I think maybe sometimes the conversation doesn't necessarily go back to actually everyone that's in a position within sport should equally be role models and held accountable to that. And I guess I'm just wondering more a question for you, Kerev. When you think of someone that could be a good leader, like you've been asked as an athlete to be a role model, what would you look for in somebody that might have a position in anti-doping? What would you be looking for in a good leader or a role model that could help lead that movement forward from an athlete perspective?
Some transparency, because one of the things that as athletes, we don't have a lot of trust, right? So we don't know who we can go to, who is on our side, who truly cares about keeping our sport clean, who hasn't been bought out or who isn't corrupt. So I think someone who can be really transparent. If somebody asks you a question, instead of being defensive, accept that question, explain it. Just having open dialogue and conversation and transparency would go a long way.
Mike, can I just follow up on trust? Because I think it was talked about earlier in the session around therapeutic use exemptions. Because I think there's also an opportunity in the future for us to think about how we support people within the system to ask those questions and not just to always believe in the person in power. Because I think that sometimes is where some challenges can sit, is where the power differential is so strong that they just go along with whatever they're told, regardless of some of the potential consequences to that. And I do think that comes through an education program of understanding about ourselves and what we're doing, but also about developing skills to ask questions, to feel comfortable to ask, well, what does that mean? And rather than just, yeah, I'll have that because I'm being told by a person who's highly powerful, and if I don't do that, then I'm potentially ostracized from sport. And I do think there's an opportunity for us in the future to think about how we facilitate that skill development.
On the topic of role models, I guess I see it as, not every athlete is going to be or wants to be a role model, but I will say, I work for a scientific company, and and one of the things we do is STEM education. We volunteer at science fairs. We do all those things. They're not huge things, but I see it as a wonderful opportunity to be able to give back. And I think, if you give, I'll bet a lot of athletes, given the opportunity and the right support, would jump at the chance, like many of us would, to promote the business, the sport, whatever that we're passionate about.
Okay, I've got time for one burning question before I come back to the panel for the final word.
Yeah, Mike, you mentioned nobody had mentioned recreational drugs. Well, Jake sort of referred to it earlier. And I just wanted to state, I think we've lost our way a little bit with recreational drugs. I mean, we've got situations here where people that have gone out and taken cocaine in a nightclub are being banned for 4 years for refusing a test. Because they thought they'd be banned. We've got Andrew Johns, who took ecstasy for 10 years to cope with the effects of depression because he was scared to come out in sport and say what he was suffering with because he feared a ban. Now, in my opinion, the American leagues, professional leagues, have got it right because they're going down as substances of abuse. Now, nobody's saying we have to do the same thing as under the World Anti-Doping Code, but you could introduce a policy whereby there is a ban, but it's not as severe as somebody who's taken EPO to get on a bike and cheat. At the moment, you can be sanctioned with the same length of ban for taking cocaine in a nightclub, and that isn't right.
So given the scope of that kind of remark and question, I'll go for Matthias, then I'll go for John, and then I'll get Kara's view, and then I'm going to go to the panel. So what do you think about the bans that are levied in relation to different kinds of substances that are prohibited? Is there an equivalence, Matthias?
I didn't really get the question.
So I'll invite you to modify what I say. So if you had, for example, a person banned for a recreational doping substance, receiving the same kind of sanction as a person for EPO or some kind of anabolic agent?
For sure not. For sure not. I'm clearly in favor, as I said, but it's really difficult. If somebody's using EPO or anabolic steroid, then it's for cheating. That's mostly its intent. And then if you have a recreational drug, it's not so. So you really do not have to have the same sanctions there.
How would you cope with that, John, in MLP?
Well, I think that's another example of where you look at the outcome, you look at the situation, you take a step back, and you think, are we accomplishing our goals of an anti-doping program through that outcome? And my personal view is, you might want to rethink that one. I think there are many examples of that where we should take the opportunity to look at the policies in place and really think, are they consistent with the overarching goals of an anti-doping program that's effective? And so I think, in the pro leagues, that's another, added point of value of our obligation to have to negotiate with our athletes. We have good people in place that are looking out for their best interest. And I think that can be an effective model for dealing with recreational drugs where it's private conduct off the field while still having a high level of integrity through an effective anti-doping program that's looking for performance-enhancing drugs, stimulants, masking agents, all of the things that could potentially impact the play on the field. They can coexist with each other on parallel tracks. And if you adjust the one side of the program, it doesn't take away from the other side.
Kara, you've been a very strong and outspoken advocate for clean sport. Do you mark a distinction between athletes who have got adverse analytical findings for different types of substances, or are they all, in your mind, people who've broken the rules?
I like to keep it simple, and that is you can't take what's on the prohibited list.
That's a clear answer. Okay. So, of the issues that have been raised then, governance, leadership, collaborative, stakeholder action through collective active organizations, better athlete representation, maybe some alternative resource prioritization. You're going to give me now in one sentence, please, starting with Matthias, the future of anti-doping depends on this one critical issue. What is it?
For me, the future of anti-doping depends really on more creativity, on more solutions that are problem-based solution, and less on administration bureaucracy. So we have to go back to the KISS principle. For me, KISS stands for keep it simple and Swiss. Swiss is high quality. Swiss is high quality, dedicated to problem solving, and highly applicable.
Peter.
It's a difficult one, and again in one sentence. I think it all comes down to that people involved in anti-doping show the same ethical standards as the ones they demand from the athletes. And I think that's what we need on all different levels.
Do that one. You're going to one word: integrity.
Yep.
Following on from that as well, I think the field has moved a long way to have a more positive message, and the embracing of clean sport, I think, has really worked strongly with athletes. I think I've heard it a lot over the last few days here at the conference. We need to move away from fight, and we need to move away from catch if we really want to empower and engage a community.
We're about 10 years removed from our internal examination of our anti-doping policies that was conducted by Senator George Mitchell, and the outcome of that investigation was there should be 3 themes of an anti-doping program: independent, transparent, and flexible. And I think those same traits would also apply to the leaders that are involved in anti-doping and those that work in anti-doping, because that are directly related to integrity.
I agree with everybody, and I would just say from the athlete's perspective, everybody who's supposed to be fighting for us, show us that you really mean what you're talking about. Don't backstep when you draw a line in the sand. Prove to us that you care, so that we can trust you moving forward.
Well, that's a very powerful message on which to end. Can I, on your behalf, thank all the panelists for your great contributions? Thank you. Michael threatened me if I went over 4:45, so here you go, Mike, on time.
I can't top anything that you said, but there are some moments that are just surreal to be a part of. And I remember in Major League Baseball headquarters in 2015 being at a PCC conference, the first one that we had hosted, and this would have been totally unbelievable at that moment. And so I thank you for everything that you've taught me in the last hour and a half. It's just remarkable. And the voices that we have up here represent the diversity and the importance of different stakeholders in the engagement. And I think I can speak for everybody who came to this conference are just better people because they heard what you just said. So thank you for that. This is going to sound like a strange transition, but I have 2 logistical things to say. There are also what? Okay, I have 3 logistical things to say. My conscience down here says that there is ice cream on the first floor, which I think people would like to know about. The second thing is that we start half an hour earlier tomorrow. The panel, the initial discussion will start at 8:30, not 9 o'clock, so that we can get everybody out of here by lunch, and so that we have the opportunity to hear from some other remarkable speakers, and then those of us that have to catch a 10-hour flight over the pond can do so tomorrow. And the third logistical thing is that other than dealing with the wonderful people and learning from the wonderful people in anti-doping, I get to give out money regularly. It's the second best part of my job. And so I get to give out some money right now. So if you did a sample collection at the mock doping control station, you have a number that's in this thing, and we are giving out $2 Amazon gift cards for participating. And so I'm gonna do this. So if you are number 34 or number 4, please see me and collect your Amazon gift card. And congratulations, and thank you again, and see everybody tomorrow morning at 8:30.